Welcome to the Elikus podcast. This is class number 11 in the discourse Tzion b'mishpat Tipadeh, which is the 11th discourse in the great book B'Shashek Dimu 5672. That means this is discourse number 11, class 11, so it's 1111, which is a big number for me. And this is going to be the second class in chapter 44. Okay, so yesterday in our previous class, we were learning that the sphirot, the attributes, have certain limitation on three levels. There is one element of limitation that is in the attributes, and that is that there is an essential difference between one attribute and the other attribute. That of essence, that is the nature of Chachma being different than the nature of Bina. As he called it, his chalkos, and a differentiation, be'etzem uchusan, in their essential essence. And then there is also a difference between the attributes and the amount of light of the Ein Sof that flows in them. And then the other difference is that there is a slowing down of the energies of the attributes coming from the vessels. Okay, we'll understand that a little better today. He brings a statement from the Zohar, where the Zohar says that regarding the spheros, that they all have what's three things: a midah, a measurement; a gvul, a border; and a tchum, and a boundary. So he's going to connect these three ideas that we just mentioned to these three names. This, that the attributes have a measurement, he explained that the attributes are fundamentally differentiated one from the other. That's called a measurement. And he proved that from Nachmanides, from the Ramban, because Ramban in his commentary on the book Sefer Yetzirah, in the book of Formation, over there it says there's the 10 spheros. The words over there are that the midas and eser, their measurement is 10, she'ein lahem sof, but they don't have an end, which seemed to be contradictory statement to say that its measurement is 10 and it has no end. So if it seems to be measuring and linking it to a very specific number. So Ramban says, although there are 10 attributes, which is a specific number, a limited number, yet at the same time, each one of these attributes have no safe, has no end to it. That means that the Chachma is infinite Chachma, infinite wisdom. The Bina is infinite Bina. But what do we see from here? The fact that we're saying that their midah, we're using the word measurement in 10, means to say that what makes them measured is that there are 10 differentiatable attributes. What differentiates them? The unique character that each one has. That each one has a something that makes a difference. In other words, the opposite of absolute pshitos. Pshitos would mean that the 10 spheros are pashut, and therefore they're indifferentiable one from the other. They're basically the same. And then you would have to ask, what makes it 10? But there is such a state, because when the spheros are still in the level of the kav, where they're just points, there really is no difference between one sphere and the other, at least discernible, because you can't see any difference. They're all overwhelmed by the Orein Sof. It's all still in a state of pure pshitos, and you really can't call them midah. There's no measure there. Because in order to be called a measure, there has to be a measurement. There has to be a definition. So in the case over here, the meaning of measurement is more a defining character. That's its meaning of measurement. But now he continues. The Zohar also says, the Zohar also says that they also have a gvul, they have a boundary. They have a border and a boundary. So he continues and he says, "V'inyan gvul tchum." This is again about 7-8 lines into chapter 44, the Inyan Gvul Tchum, and the idea of a border and a boundary. It says on Lukuti Torah, Babir Devayered Agvul. In the explanation on the pasuk Vayered Agvul, which is a pasuk in Maseh, where the Torah, where it talks about the borders of the land of Israel. So over there is a discourse. There's the discourse, and then there is an explanation on the discourse. So on the beer of Vayered Agvul, over there, the Alter Rebbe explains that Tchum and Gvul is the same idea. Shuinyan Echad is one idea. It's that the Sfirot have a limit to how much of the Or Ein Sof is shining in them. That's what he says over there, that there is a certain limitation to the energy flow. The Or Ein Sof, as it is higher than the Sfiros, is limitless. When the Or Ein Sof shines through the Sfiros, it has already, the Sfiros create a boundary, and he explains that that's primarily because of the Kalim. The vessels take this, the oil itself, the light itself, before it settles in vessels, is pure. When the light goes into the vessels give limitation, and that's the idea of gvul, of border, and tchum, and boundary. However, he's going to say over here, the Rebbe Rashab is going to say, that is if what the Alter Rebbe was saying is a more general state. But if you really dig in and go into specific, there is a difference between the two. And what is the difference? Via Shloima, we can say. So again, this is the Chiddush of the Rebbe Rashab, of the author, in which he's now adding on to what his grandfather says. And he's saying, we can find a difference between the two. The Gavol, when we say border, we mean a limitation in the manner of how it reveals itself. In beriboy oy b'miut, if it's coming in a lot of light or only a little bit of light, that means it's a kind of self-restraining element in the oil itself. Yes, and maybe this that the Alter Rebbe says that they're both related to the vessels. That's because this feature in the light only activates when it goes into a vessel. When the lights are in the abstract and they're not in the vessels, then this whole concept of more and less is not present, because the Or Ein Sof is equal in all the sfirot on that level before they go into, when it's pure lights. But when the lights settle in the vessels, then the light itself self-regulates. As we learned earlier, that the kav kind of decides how much light will shine into each sphera. The kav is still light; it's not vessels yet. So this is a self-regulating element within the light itself, that it restrains itself to how much it will pour into each cup. But then when we say boundary, is a superimposed limitation that's coming actually from the vessel. The vessel is producing, in other words, the light itself would not be bounded by the boundary, would not be, this particular limitation is not coming from a self-regulation in the light, but rather the vessels are imposing an added layer of limitation onto the sphera, onto the attribute. The tchum and tchum, hu ha'agabala, is a limitation, v'ha'hefsek, and an interruption, sha'idei ha'kelim. It's that the vessels slow down the light, or the vessels interrupt the light. Meaning to say that until here you can come, further than this you stop, restraining the light, so that the next sphera can emerge, or that to leave room for something else. Like it is stated in the book Biurei HaZohar. That's a book of the Alter Rebbe's Maimarim, written down as it recorded by the Mittler Rebbe, the second Chabad Rebbe. So there is a path where over there is discourses of the Alter Rebbe where he's giving explaining passages of the Zohar. Maimars are on the passage of the Zohar. Bamidbar daf kuf yot ches. In Bamidbar daf kuf yot ches amid beis. B'masha kasev when this that it says itcham betchumei. There it says, it speaks about the tree, I think, the Elon, high Elon, this godly tree, which is explained, the tree of the Eitz HaChaim, the tree of life, which is the Sfirot, that's called the tree of life. It is bounded, itcham, it has boundaries, bitchume, with his boundaries. That means it doesn't flow infinitely and freely, it gets restrained by boundaries. Shazahu, which is mitzad HaKelim, which that boundary, when we say tchum, a boundary that's related to the boundary coming from the vessels. And he now explains, what does that mean? Isn't there already a limitation, a self-regulation, where the light that's flowing into Chachma, into the vessel of Chachma, releases itself into Chachma with a certain potency that is more powerful than when the light flows into Bina, where it's, as we learned earlier, the Or Ein Sof is shining berichuk makam, at a distance, which means in a more restrained way and in a lesser way. So if that's the case, what is the added constrictions or constraints that are being added over here? So he explains. Even after Chachma receives its prescribed dosage, and we're going to see soon the kav. The kav is the allocator. The kav is that thin thread of Or Ein Sof that is also called kav hamoded. Hamoded. It's a line, a thread that acts as a ruler, as a measuring device, as a measuring tool, and it exacts a specific amount of energy to be released into each sphere. So even after that is already established, that Chachma will receive 1,000 voltages of light or luminance, and Bina will receive 200 luminance or voltage or whatever you're going to call it. And the emotions will receive even less than that, for example. Even after that, there is another constraint that's coming from the vessels. And what does that do? That diminishes the light, slows down the light within the attribute itself. This is what we learned earlier, that in every attribute, as the attribute descends to influence the next attribute, there is a diminishment and some kind of a diluting of the energy. The power gets decreased. Remember, we were learning in Chachma that in the higher elements of Chachma, there is vision. In vision, it's super powerful. As we go down past, that's the Chabad of Chachma and the Chagas of Chachma, Chesed Gevurah Teferes of Chachma, where there is still impact of the vision. But when you get to the Netzach Hod Yesod of Chachma, the lower spheres of Chachma, called in him the practical parts of the Chachma, where Chachma is already seriously considering its transmission to the next sphere, over there it's no more a vision, it becomes more just a hanacha, an inlay, like we discussed earlier. And then finally there is the chitzonius of the Chachma, the external element of the Chachma that becomes actually intellectual, and the intellectual point, and that translates to Bina. How does that happen? That in Chachma itself, there is a downgrading of the energy from level to level. That happens because of the vessels of Chachma. The vessels slow down the light, as we're going to see. This is the idea of the diminishment, Sheba HaSfira Atzma, that is in the Sfira itself. Her light becomes diminished in the lower levels of each Sfira, Sheba, that's in it, and that's in order. You see, the self-regulating limitation that is within the initial flow of energy that flows into the Sfira is not related to the influence coming from this Sfira to the next Sfira, to the next attributes. They're coming in a sequence of attributes. It's not because of the transmission from. that is related to the nature and the character of each attribute as the attribute lives for itself. That means even if the attribute would not have any neighbors, even if the attribute would not have anyone that is being influenced by it, but the attribute would just be a self-contained and an attribute living on an island for itself, it would still be regulated by the initial allocation of how much light flows into it. But then there is something else. Since every attribute acts in a chain, from Chachma the energy goes to Bina. From Bina the energy goes into the emotions. The emotions, they flow into Malchus, into kingship. That process of influence from level to level requires the energy that is requires the output to be less than the input. The energy that's flowing into the sphere cannot be with the same potent and power that the energy that is going to go out of the sphere. So in order to acclimate the energy for its passage to the next attribute, it needs to go through a process of diminishment. That process of diminishment is not regulated by the initial light. That is the job of the vessels. And in order to bring forth, to emanate the next sphere. This limitation, this is already happening through the vessels. Since the vessels, just like the vessels limit the light, to make the light go into a state of somethingness, to become become more of an entity, as we'll see in a moment, as well. So similar to that, they limit its expansion. Until here you can come. Now you got to slow down because someone else make room for the next, for a level, for another sphere, for another attribute to emerge. Perek Reish Peches. And look, come on. I'm sorry, not come on and see what is going to be explained later in chapter Reish Peches, 288. I guess we have a while till we get there. All right, what is he saying over here? The one of the influences and probably the primary influence that the vessels have on the light is that the light itself is very, very abstract. The light of the spheres. Even after the reduction of the kav and so on and so forth, as long as the light has not settled into vessels, the lights are very abstract. When they go into the vessel, it thickens or tangibilizes those lights to become far more of substance. What does that mean? We use the example. I mean, this was discussed actually right in the beginning of the whole entire book. In the first discourse, B'Shashe Ekdimu, a long time ago, that we learned about 2 years ago. And over there we discussed that we used the metaphor of the powers of the soul going into the body. The soul has a power of vision, but the soul's power of vision is utterly spiritual. We don't even know what that vision means. It's the power to see in the realm of the spiritual. But when the soul encloses itself in a body and the power of vision interacts with the physical eye, that means goes into the vessel, the physical eye takes that spiritual power of vision and concretizes it to become a power and a lens to be able to see the material objects of this world. Same is also in the power of hearing. The same is also in the intelligence. The soul, when the soul is disembodied, the soul is a pure spirit without any matter, its intelligence is very, very lofty and very, very abstract. But when the soul becomes enclosed in a body and its power of intelligence vests itself in the gray matter of the brain, that physical substance takes that abstract power and brings it into a more physical state, so that the intellectual powers of the mind are now perceiving and understanding and operating within the physical universe, and have a certain physicality, a thickness to its mind, to see and appreciate and understand how the physical world works. And we lose the ability to be able to have a clear understanding in the spiritual. When we study a lot of Torah and we learn a lot of Hasidus, that helps us to a certain degree undo the physical limitations from our mind to be able to perceive and understand also to a certain degree in the spiritual. But even when we do that and spend our lifetime pursuing that, when a person's soul leaves their body and they get to free their mind from the physical constraints, they suddenly perceive and understand those very ideas that they understood in this world with such sharpness and clarity, and such that the spiritual world suddenly becomes so real with it, and their understanding and their intellectual powers and grasp is like, wow. And they realize how limited it was when they were seeing or hearing or understanding through the physical constraints. So therefore, he says, it comes out that the body takes the abstract powers and makes it more material and physical. So the same is also regarding the kalim, the vessels of the divine attributes. Although they are a gazillion times, even that is not a good number. They're infinitely more spiritual than our soul is, even those vessels. The vessels are utterly divine. But compared to the light, it's compared to a body. So when the light of God, of the Sphirot, which is super, super abstract, is enclosed in those vessels thicken it. So now he's saying, just like the vessels superimpose a certain limitation onto the lights, to take the lights from their very abstraction and make it far more defined with definitions. Let's say for kindness becomes a noticeable kindness. Compassion becomes a noticeable compassion. And so too, in addition to that, it also limits the flow of that energy, that it should come in with a certain measure, that till here is where you expand. Now you have to slow down, because the next attribute is going to come. Can't have a limitless expansion. But all of this is coming, that's the boundary that's coming from the vessels. Okay, so now this is the conclusion of his explanation of the three expressions in the Zohar of how the Sphirot are limited. They have a midah, they have a measure, they have a border, and they have a boundary. And now he says, but who's really responsible for all of this? What's really affecting and making all of this happen? That's because, how does the Or Ein Sof, which is infinite, suddenly measure itself with these measurements? Because the one that's responsible, we learned it from the beginning of the discourse. First is pure Or Ein Sof, infinite light. And then the infinite light rolls back through this powerful force called Tzimtzum, which creates an empty absence, pure absence of light, a dark black hole, so to speak. And then God reprojects or reemerges into the darkness, but this time he's coming through a thin light, a thin ray of light, a beam of light. That beam is called the Kav. So in addition to that Kav being a expression of the light, but when we're calling it a Kav, is because it becomes the source for all limitation regarding the divine energy. Because the only reason there was a tzimtzum and a contraction was because God wanted to create the worlds, and worlds are limited. So the energy input that's going to flow into these worlds, the divine energy, the infinite energy that's going to flow into the world, has to be limited. What limits it? The fact that it's coming through this beam, through this kav, through this thread, which is also called a moded, a measurer. The klal samadida, and the general power to measure the spheres in these 10 spheres, kav, comes through this line, shemoided, that measures oifane hagiluyim, the manner of the revelations, biha spheres, in the 10 spheres, and it makes in them mila umata, and up and a down. B'pchinas ribui, what does that mean? Up and a down. Number one, b'pchinas ribui yamiyut. What creates this whole system of higher sphirot and lower sphirot? It's because in the higher spheres there is more light, and in the lower spheres, as we're going down, we're downgrading the light. Again, ribui yamiyut, more abundance and diminishment in where? In the light and in the revelation. But not only that, and also the up and the down that we said that exists in the sphere is unrelated to how much light flows into them, but rather the fundamental difference that differentiates the sphere, one sphere from the other, on a more essential quality. The up and the down, in their essential levels, that chachma should be in this manner. And bina should be in this manner. Like we learned earlier, the whole explanation. How chachma gets to experience the essence of it, and bina only stays on the outside and only gets to experience the descriptions of something. These differences, these fundamental differences, are also attributed to the kav. In other words, the kav produces the variations of the spheres. Now, even though we've already learned, I can ask a question. Hold it, didn't we learn there's spheros? First of all, in the kav itself, we learned that the kav is made up of dots. A line is made up of dots. And the dots are the 10 spheros. 10 dots. And the kav, really, if we trace the kav even earlier, we discussed that there is, even before the tzimtzum, in the Or Ein Sof, before the tzimtzum, there is already the concept of spheres hagnuzas, the 10 hidden spheres, which means that there is already chachma, bina. So there's a difference between one and the other. The answer is that until the lights do not come into Atzilus, there really is no difference between sphera and sphera, because they are still in a state of pshitus, in a state of simplicity. Their characteristics are not in any way expressed and known. And therefore, although it's almost like we can say from them will evolve, it's like a seed, that from it will evolve like when you look at seeds from different fruits, especially the seeds, you won't be able to tell, looking at the seed, how one is different. Now, in our fruits, if you look at an apple seed and an orange seed, you can see the difference. But in one species itself, for instance, you can't really tell the difference when you're looking at the seed. So these are in such an abstract state that there is no difference between them. And the differences between them are when they will arrive in the world of Atzilus. What's the medium of the spheres saknuzais, of the 10 hidden spheres, when they are swallowed up and absorbed completely in the Or Ein Sof, and their state when they're in Atzilus, when they are fully manifest, that chachma is chachma and bina is bina, and so on and so forth. It's the medium in between them is the kav. That's why the kav is called the moded, the measurer. Hakalum and kav. It's all from the kav. Liyois, and the reason for that is, why is the kav measuring it? Meaning to say, if the spheros would be born directly from the Or Ein Sof, not from the kav, then you wouldn't have all this differentiation wouldn't be there. The differentiation between the spheres is because the spheres are receiving from the Or Ein Sof via the Kav. Why does that difference? Why does that make a difference? He says because it's that's because the Kav is pulling the origins of the Kav is in the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, but remember, in the Eser Spheros of the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. In other words, in the second of the Or Pnimi that is within the Or Makif. Meaning, in the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, there is the concept of Eser Spheros Agnuzais, which, as we said already earlier, is a secondary element within the Or Ein Sof. That's really the source of these differentiations. But again, in Or Ein Sof, all you sense is infinity and boundlessness and simplicity. Over there, it's not felt at all. The Kav is where it starts to become possible to differentiate these spheres because you're already pulling 10 dots. When they're in the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, they're all one big mush. In each sphera, there is all the spheros together. You don't have 10. It's just a pure, simple abstraction. It's only in the Kav that at least you're getting 10 dots. But again, it's still only dots, but when the Kav delivers now the energy to produce each sphera in these spheros, especially when they are now dropping into vessels, that's when these limitations come out into the open. Since in the Kav, even in the root of the Kav, Yesh Pchinas Esa Spherois, there is already 10 Spherois. Shen Esa Spherois Agnuzais, which they are the 10 hidden Spherois. But hold it. If the real, and I'm going to ask the question, and therefore, since the Kav comes from the Esa Spherois Agnuzais, that's the reason why the Kav is measuring out and limiting the regulating the definitions of the spheres and limiting the energy flow. But the question obviously is going to be a big question. Why are you then attributing this to the Kav? The real source of limitation is the Esa Spheres Agnuzais. So the 10 hidden spheres that are still in the Ein Sof. Why the Kav is only like a kind of the medium. But so why are you calling the Kav the limiting factor? Why not refer to the Esa Spheres Agnuzais as the limiting factor? The answer is there is another important factor over here. Between the Esa Spheres Agnuzais and the Kav is a tzimtzum, the first tzimtzum. And that's the major point over here. Since the Kav is drawn through the tzimtzum, it means that in order to have the Kav, there had to first be a tzimtzum. That tzimtzum and that contraction is what creates limitation. Before that contraction and that then even though there is some kind of koa esa spheres agnuzas, which is some kind of a limitation in the Or Ein Sof, that limitation is swallowed up completely by the infinity of the Ein Sof. Or Ein Sof B is completely embedded in Or Ein Sof A, and you don't see no 10 sphera. That's what it means gnuzas. Gnuzas means they're hidden. They're not seen at all. All you have is pure Or Ein Sof. So you can't see over there that there's any measuring element. There is a tzimtzum. The tzimtzum hides and blocks the Or Ein Sof, so that now when now it can allow Or Ein Sof B to shine forth through the Kav, which means the Esa Spheres Agnuzais potential that's in the Or Ein Sof can now come out in the Kav. And when they come out in the Kav, they're not coming out as one unified power of 10. They're already a line, and a line is made up of dots, which means dots are already, the beginning of each sphera is already there, the soul of it, the nucleus of each one is there. But while it's the Kav, you can still sense a beam of Ein Sof, so you can't see it yet, but at least you have already points over here. That's the point that he's saying. In the drawing of the Kav. Who are they at Tzimtzum is through the Tzimtzum. Shenim Shach, in which that allows for that what? That is what's being drawn as spheres pratiyos. It's drawn individual spheres. It's like we learned earlier that in the mind of the teacher, the whole concept is one concept. But when they start talking, remember we learned that you take a sentence and you break up the letters, you break up the words, you break up then each one becomes a separate entity. That's the point over here. And even though and even though in the kav they're still in a state of simplicity, adayin, and this is the idea that the kav is made up of just points, just dots. Commotion is El Perek Lamed Aleph, like we said earlier in chapter 31. Nevertheless, it can already be called a measuring, a kav, a line that measures. Limdoi, to measure mohusas spherois, to measure the substance of the spherois, that the sphere should be in this state. This sphere should be like this sphere should be like that, and so forth. Shazen Nicker, when are we going to actually be? Now, in the kav itself, you're still not seeing it because it's only points, but it's like a measuring stick or a ruler. A ruler itself is not part of the measurement of the building, but the ruler measures the building. It gives measure to that which is being measured. And the reason why the ruler is able to measure something is because it itself has a measure. So the kav itself is in a very abstract way already measured, and therefore it can produce real measurement. But where is the real measurement going to come out? In Atzilus, which is already the beginning of the worlds. This becomes more recognizable in the 10 spheres of Atzilus. Because over there they already enclose themselves in vessels. Like we explained earlier in chapter 32. They become, through this, they become in a state of somethingness. That's when they become recognizable that this is apples and this is oranges. Between up and down, in their substance and in their level. Two things. In their substance, that one is different than the other fundamentally, and also in their level, and I think he means regarding how much light is shining in them. Here comes more light, and here comes less light. We're going to leave it over here. It can be continued by Ezra Hashem tomorrow.